Our NATO leaders set to agree on a new master plan vowing a stronger, expanded security alliance to counter Russia and China, both of which have labelled the strategy destabilising. And for more on the NATO summit, we're joined by Professor Michael Kimmage from the Department of History at the Catholic University of America and Eva Hagstrom Frisell. Now, she's Deputy Research Director at the Swedish Defence Research Agency. Welcome, both of you. The last few hours, we've heard NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying historic decisions will be made at this summit, the biggest overhaul of our collective defence since the end of the Cold War. Now, both of you would have seen what comes out of summits like these. There's a need for NATO to talk up its unity, talk up its strength. But in this instance, how much is rhetoric running ahead of reality? Professor Kimmage, let's start with you.
Well, at these events, I think rhetoric almost always runs a bit ahead of the reality. But it's also the case this time around that there are really two significant developments that Finland and Sweden are not quite members yet, but Turkey has publicly agreed to their joining the alliance, and the U.S. has also committed a substantial increase in its troop presence, especially on the eastern flank of the NATO alliance. So those are non-trivial, non-rhetorical developments, but some of the rhetoric is a bit more expansive than the reality.
Ms. Hagstrom Frisell.
For my part, I believe that there is a shift going on in NATO's deterrence and defense posture, primarily against the threat from Russia. There is talk about an enhanced forward presence on the eastern flank with land units up to brigade level, but also pre-positioning of equipment and developing defense plans and command and control arrangements to be able to reinforce these countries rapidly.
Ms. Hagstrom Frisell, this enhanced forward presence, also the idea that in moving from deterrence by reinforcement to deterrence by denial, that's a big move for NATO, given its fear of escalation. We heard Volodymyr Zelensky coming out asking for more weapons, and NATO has held back because they do not want to escalate the crisis. Is it credible, is it realistic to talk about enhanced forward presence, deterrence by denial, and still be able to maintain not escalating any conflict with Russia?
Well, it's actually about defending NATO territory, which is not an escalation in itself. But there have been arguments, for example, from the Baltic states and Poland to increase this forward presence even further to a forward defense. And that remains to be seen a little bit how this reinforcement will look, because it's up to a brigade level from NATO countries deployed to the Baltic states and Poland, but parts of these forces will be kept in their home country and only deployed when it's necessary. But that's where those developed defense plans with assigned forces come in. That will make it a little bit more clear how the defense will actually be carried out in these countries.
All right, and a big help in terms of this defense will be Sweden and Finland actually joining NATO. And Professor Kimmage, let's pick up on your point. These are non-trivial, concrete, non-rhetorical changes. In fact, European security order, that will be transformed with a long-time militarily non-aligned and nominally neutral Finland and Sweden becoming members of NATO. And with Ankara as today lifting its veto on their membership, that's likely to happen sooner rather than later. Earlier, we spoke to former Finnish Prime Minister, that's Alexander Stubb. Now, he's a long-time and very vocal proponent for Finland joining NATO. He says he has Mr. Putin to thank for tipping the balance in favour of membership. Let's take a listen.
There was very much this feeling in 2008 when Putin attacked Georgia that, okay, this wasn't perhaps serious enough. Same thing with Crimea, 2014. But now, when there was full-on conventional warfare coming from Russia this led to our change of opinion, first in the public and then in the political leadership. Finland took a decision in the early 1990s not to join NATO, but to integrate ourselves as closely to the NATO system as possible. That meant that we started to comply, basically, with the membership criteria of NATO. So 2% of the defense budget, size of our military, both in the air, land, and in the sea. And we also participated in key NATO peacekeeping operations, which basically meant that we are more NATO compatible than most NATO states. So in that sense, I think Finnish NATO membership from a military compatibility perspective is a walk in the park. Pure win-win, both for the alliance and for us.
Oh, both of you, we heard Finland's former Prime Minister there being very careful to stress from a military compatibility perspective. Finland and Sweden will bring considerable assets militarily to NATO. But strategically, there are questions being raised in terms of tipping the balance for Europe's place in NATO, Europe's ties with Washington as well. Ms. Hagstrom Frisell, your take on that?
Well, I would actually agree with Mr. Stubb also about Sweden's relationship to NATO. That's been a gradually evolving relationship since the mid-1990s, where Sweden actually skipped neutrality and moved on to military non-alignment and stressing that security is built together with others, increasing bilateral and multilateral defense cooperations. But Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that these quite close defense ties was not sufficient and that NATO membership is necessary to receive security guarantees. And of course, Sweden's and Finland's membership will enhance the perspective from NATO's north, and the threat from Russia is the primary threat for these countries, and that will of course affect the balance within NATO. And as we saw, Turkish initial opposition to Swedish and Finnish membership was exactly out of the concern that they believe that the threat from terrorism and more to NATO's south should be more prominent within NATO.
A very quick answer from you, Professor Kimmage, following from Ms. Hagstrom Frisell. Do you think this in any way challenges Europe's idea of, or its ambitions rather, for strategic autonomy if Finland and Sweden, instead of building up defence and security within the EU, which they could have done because it also has a mutual defence treaty, instead of that, opting instead for Washington-centric NATO?
Well, this is a moment of American leadership in terms of the crisis with Russia. I think that's at the moment very highly appreciated and valued in Europe, and it just elevates NATO above the EU as a security structure. I think that's just the fact of the situation, and that's how it's seen in Sweden, is how it's seen in Finland, and of course Washington is quite happy with the situation.
All right. Staying with you there, Professor Kimmage, essentially it's about NATO expansion. Of course, Finland and Sweden, they will be members 31 and 32. NATO itself is 30 large right now. Let's take a look. It started with 12 in 1949, picking up another 4 members during the Cold War years. Let's take a look there. And with another 14 in the post-Cold War years from 1990, including the so-called Big Bang expansion of 2004. Professor Kimmage, you wrote just a month before Russia's invasion in February of how NATO suffers from a severe design flaw. You said it's too large, too poorly defined, and too provocative for its own good. With the benefit of hindsight now, would you want to tweak your assessment?
Well, certainly it's a new world, and the issue of provoking Russia is in a sense pointless or obsolete because Russia has taken such an aggressive posture. If there's any value that remains to that article or to that point of view, it's that NATO began in 1947 as something very discrete and well-defined. There was an Iron Curtain that separated it from the other side. Now NATO is fluid and dynamic and very much larger. There are lots of benefits that come with that, but of course it expands the challenges and some of the risks that NATO faces. NATO's border with Russia now is going to be substantially larger. That is going to place certain pressures on the alliance and bring certain new challenges to bear. So that's perhaps the cost of this decision, but I think it's clear what the benefits are as well.
Ms. Hagstrom Frisell, the benefits would be the amount of resources that NATO can call on, but within the EU, we're already seeing not so efficient spending on military hardware, software, and having more members, you are creating potentially more lack of unity, more division. Do you see the size of NATO as an issue? And if that should be the case, what can be done to create greater sense of unity, unity of purpose in terms of the EU finding a national strategy on defense?
Well, I would actually say that Finland's and Sweden's membership to NATO would facilitate the defense of NATO territory, for example, in the Baltic states, because sending reinforcement to those states will be much easier, having access to Swedish airspace and Swedish maritime waters. And it will also, as I said, create new opportunities to draw up regional defense plans and designate commands and assign forces. So I think it will facilitate rather than lead to divisions. But when it comes to the EU, I think that this war in Ukraine has also shown the value of the EU, but that is not when it comes to the military defense. It's more coordinating the economic sanctions, giving economic and humanitarian support to Ukraine, and now also with the decision to give Ukraine candidate status to the EU. That is a way to help and transform Ukraine for the future. And the EU's defense cooperation can also facilitate in coordinating investments that support the collective defense.
Or a final question.
So I think both the EU and NATO are good for the future.
All right, final question to the two of you. The strategic concept that will be updated at this summit, taking into account China, which Jens Stoltenberg has already described as a challenge, and Russia as a threat. Very quickly, Professor Kimmage, you take the first question. What do you see in this new strategic concept? What do you think it will achieve?
Well, challenge is a concession to the Western Europeans who would prefer not to use the word threat with China, which I think is more Russia's, rather the United States' point of view. I don't think that this is a top-line issue for NATO. I think everything depends on the kind of support NATO gives to Ukraine. That will, in effect, be NATO's China policy. But increasingly, there's a link between Asia and Europe. It's very different from where NATO was 10 years ago.
All right, very quickly, Ms. Hagstrom Frisell.
Well, yes, I think the strategic concept will actually define the threats and challenges NATO face, but also more importantly, how to handle them. And there, I think the measures will be more clear when it comes to handling the threat from Russia than what NATO actually should do when it comes to the challenge from China.
All right, thanks so much for joining us, Professor Michael Kimmage and Ms. Eva Hagstrom Frisell.